Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Just as a note, we are waiting on Senator Carla Nelson to join us, our last legislative member. And once we have all of the chairs with us on the call, then we will get started.
See if you can hear my audio.
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Quick mic check.
There we go.
In the interest of time, I think we'll get about another minute and then go ahead and get started and hope that Chair Nelson can join us if she's having any technical problems. Okay, I think that we will go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a virtual session of the Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans 2020 session recap panel on E-12 education. In particular, I would like to thank our legislators for joining us. Currently on the line, we have Chair Jim Dabney, Chair Cheryl Kim, and we are expecting Chair Carla Nelson to be joining us, but we, in the interest of time and wanting to be able to be respectful of everyone's schedules, get started and hope that Chair Nelson can join us. For those of you who may not be familiar with our office, the Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans is a nonpartisan, independent agency established by the Minnesota legislature within the executive branch of the state government. The Council has the statutory duty to serve as the bridge between the state government and Asian and Pacific Islander Minnesotans, both by directly connecting state government to API Minnesotans and by advocating directly on their behalf. My name is Andy Morris, and I serve as the Public Affairs and Legislative Liaison with the Council, and I will be moderating today's discussion as part of my responsibilities. We are also joined by other Council staff, including our Research Director, Anjali Cameron, Research Assistant, Daniel Yang, Office Manager, Virachi Singh, and our Executive Director, Sia Her. The objectives of today's conversation are part of our statutory duties to continually inform the community of key legislative developments as it's related to the interests of the community. Another key element is to be able to directly connect community members with both their own legislators and, in instances such as this, with committee chairs and other important legislators who hold key positions within the legislature. Finally, It's important that even during times when the legislature is not in session or in special session, as has been the case recently, that community members are aware that work with the legislature and with their representatives continues at all times, as we heard frequently from our comments with our discussion yesterday. Having said that, the 2020 legislative year has been unlike any other in recent memory. The arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic in our state and the protests and unrest following the murder of George Floyd have created a sense of urgency and need for leadership that has far exceeded that of a typical year. The usual processes of state government and of the legislature have also been upended, requiring perseverance, creative thinking, and intentional use of limited time and resources to ensure that the voices of Minnesotans are heard and reflected in the policies developed by our leaders. While many issues have emerged, one of the most pressing concerns for families across the state has been E-12 education and the changes that have resulted from COVID-19. To discuss the issues related to these topics, and I'm glad that we have reached this point, we are joined by Chair Carlin Nelson, the Chair of the Senate E-12 Finance and Policy Committee, Chair Jim Davney, Chair of the House Education Finance Division, and Chair Cheryl Joachim, Chair of the House Education Policy Committee. Chair Nelson represents District 26, which is centered on the city of Rochester and its communities to the south and east. Chair Nelson was first elected to the Minnesota legislature as a member of the House of Representatives in 2002. She was then elected to the Senate in 2010 and is currently serving her third term in that chamber. Chair Davney represents District 36A in Minneapolis. Chair Davney was first elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives in 2000 and is currently serving his 10th term. Chair Joachim represents District 46B, which includes the cities of St. Louis Park and Hopkins. Chair Joachim was first elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives in 2014 and is currently serving her third term. Once again, I would like to thank all three chairs for taking the time out of their busy schedules to join us today. In particular, I also want to thank all three chairs for their work on behalf of all of Minnesota's students, and as it relates to the work of this past session and the 2019 session, work on legislation to increase the percentage of teachers of color in our state, a priority for our council. Before we begin, I'd like to provide an overview of our agenda. We'll begin the panel with a moderated discussion with the members about their work this year during the session and look ahead to the fall and 2021 session. We will then open the panel to questions from the community. If you have a question you would like to ask, please submit them at any time in the chat window. We will try to get to as many community submitted questions as possible. The event today will be capped with closing remarks by the Council's Executive Director, Sia Her. After Sia speaks, we will give the panelists an opportunity to leave us with their final thoughts before we adjourn the meeting. And with that, I would like to invite the chairs to introduce themselves. Perhaps Chair Davney, would you like to kick us off?
Certainly, thank you very much, and thank you to the council for inviting us to be here today. It's great to have this opportunity to interact with Minnesota's Asian and Pacific Islander community in a way that unfortunately is distance, but in a way that also allows for broader participation than an event that's held in one physical place that presents a different set of limitations. I'm pleased to be here, and we'll look forward to the conversation and opening remarks. This was a challenging, frustrating legislative session, and our work is clearly not over, whether it's on issues around K-12 education, around response to the COVID-19 virus, or response to the systemic racism in Minnesota, most recently expressed by the murder of George Floyd, and the issues that that has exposed for all of us to consider and the legislature to lead on. So thank you.
Thank you. Chair Joachim, would you like to go next?
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for welcoming us here today to discuss both what happened during session and what may be happening in the future. Chair Dabney said it right. COVID kind of interrupted our natural flow of the legislative session. We were really poised in education policy to tackle some of our bigger opportunity gaps and put some policies in place that we were going to be very proud of. Unfortunately, COVID came in the middle of that and shortened everybody's agenda. During special session, we were able to pass a very small, slimmed down version of an education policy bill, but we have so much more to do for our students. We have seen that the move to distance learning has exacerbated the opportunity gap, and more students are falling behind. And even students that were doing well aren't doing well, and vice versa. We have been embarking on conversations across the state for the last few months, and now moving into 3 different committee hearings, informational committee hearings between Chair Dabney and I in the House, to hear from all the organizations, students, parents, teachers, administrators, principals, school counselors, school nurses, school social workers over the next few days, just to have voices at the table to talk about the opportunities and challenges that distance learning provides, how we can maybe reimagine how we're delivering education services to our students, and what this fall may look like. So thank you so much for having us here today.
Thank you for joining us. Chair Nelson, it looks as though some of your technical issues have been resolved. We can see you now, and I'd like to invite you to offer an introduction. Oh, it appears that you're on mute.
All right.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Very good to be with you, and I thank you for hosting today's meeting. It is a great honor and privilege and duty, really, to be a chair on any of our education committees. I'm glad to have that role in the Minnesota Senate. We know, I believe the people on this call know, that education is the great equalizer. It is truly the moral issue of our day, the economic issue of our day, and the racial issue of our day. Making sure students have access to a high quality education is what opens up, and it's the key. It's the key to the opportunities that our state and our country offer. And so that is where we are very much focused in the Minnesota Senate, is focusing on students, funding what works. And I am more than happy to talk about some of the things that we have done in the past, and then also looking ahead to what we can do going forward, particularly in this time of great uncertainty for our schools. It's a great challenge to be given, well, we could have school like normally, which I think is what everybody would like to see, or we could have schools closed like they were from March 13th on. And that's something that I think we're all hoping to avoid, but we don't know if the health indicators will require that. And then the third option, this hybrid model. And that's where we have focused in the Senate, looking at how can we make sure our schools have the tools, all of our teachers have the tools so that they can practice that and participate in that hybrid model. And those are some of the things we also did in the Senate, making sure that we passed additional broadband funding so that all of our students, number one, have access to the high-speed information highway, and then also they have to have the devices that allow for that. And so those were some of the challenges, and I'll look forward to visiting about those type of things later as we move into our comments further today. And also, most importantly, really preparing for what is an uncertain future, but we know it's essential that every one of our students receive and have opportunity for that great education. And we're concerned a little bit too about learning loss during the distance learning from March 13th on. So I'll look forward to the rest of the discussion today. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much to all 3 of you. To start, I would like to begin our conversation by looking back on the work that your committees and the legislature as a whole have done. And just to kind of give a sense of the arc of the session and some of the priorities, even though in advance of the 2020 regular session in January, and during the first month or so in February and early March may seem like a lifetime ago for many of us. I'd be interested to hear both a sense of how the priorities that your committees were focused on either changed or perhaps even stayed the same.
Well, I guess I could go first. I don't know if you want to call on us or how you'd like to do this.
Well, if anybody would like to jump in at some point, I understand we're all, there are many educators here, so perhaps I should call on people or you can raise your hand. But I'd just like to keep this, we'd like to keep this a fairly free-flowing conversation.
As I kind of said in my opening, we were poised to really dig into the unfinished business we had last year on education policy and expand into more policy that would help with our opportunity gap, such as the language around the Teachers of Color Act, non-exclusionary discipline, social emotional learning, helping our Native American students. But with COVID, it really did interrupt the normal flow, and it took a few weeks to almost a month for the legislature to kind of get their footing on track too. We needed some planning time around distance legislating as well. So while we were able to get a small education policy bill out during a special session, we really need to be all hands on deck and all focused next year on what we can do to stem our opportunity gap, because like I said before, it has been very clear from the conversations I've had over the last few months across the state that distance learning has really thrown a lot of kids for a loop, and not just our kids that are in our opportunity gap.
Just to build upon that, yes, we do believe that the distance learning, and I salute our teachers and our school leaders who were able to basically turn on a dime, turn from classroom education, in person, face to face, every day, every student, and within 8 days somehow magically turn that into distance learning. That was, quite frankly, an impossible task. But I salute our educators who I think did a terrific job, and the parents too. I mean, this was a change for parents to suddenly be home and be the mom or dad that was making sure their students were online and doing the work that was needed and being there to answer those questions by the side. And that, well, often parents were telecommuting themselves and working from home. So, this time in history will go down as a very unusual time. And I think Minnesotans stood tall and persevered through this. But to set that aside, I think there were challenges. There were challenges in not having the broadband connections and the devices as well. The things that we were focused on in the Senate, of course, as you know, it was a policy year, and last year was our funding year. So we spent a good amount of time funding our schools, actually our highest funding levels, a historic funding for our schools last year. Little did we know that COVID would be upon us this year. And even this year, we spent a good deal of time. We had to pass a particular COVID response education bill that allowed all of the funding that our state had appropriated for our schools to get to our schools. Much of our funding, as members know, and as many in your audience will know, is based upon Carnegie units, the number of students in seats for how many days, how many hours, how many classes. And with distance learning, that was a very different model. And so it was imperative that we make sure that we pass that funding, those funding changes, those extensions on deadlines, all of those type of things to make sure all the funding, that historic funding appropriated to our schools, actually got to them. So that was one of the things that we needed to do even this year in this policy bill. And then to add to what Chair Joachim said, I think we did. I felt like we did lose about a month of Senate hearing time. I know I was pushing right away, saying we must and we can. The rest of the world works on Zoom or different platforms for telecommuting. And quite frankly, we were just a little antiquated in the legislature. And so it did take a month, I think, for everyone to ramp up to that. And then, of course, voting. Quite frankly, we're required to be in person voting. And in the Minnesota Senate, unlike the House, I was a House member too, you could have somebody push your voting button for you in the House. You could not do that in the Senate. The Senate required that every senator be there in person and vote at their own desk with their own voting buttons. And so it took us some rule changes to get to the point where we could actually vote. And then also this I think impacted the House more because it's a body that's twice as large as the Senate. Voting took a lot longer because there was remote voting. So it almost took an hour for the House, for example, to get through all of the remote voting. So that also slowed things down. But the things that we did focus on in that policy bill, and I was glad to see it pass. Senator Joachim mentioned some of those things. We also, things that were not in that policy bill that we had planned to focus on were things like additional school safety innovation, civics, letters, addressing the vaping epidemic, and Q, collaborative urban educators. And at some point today, I hope we get to talk about letters. If we're going to talk about changing the achievement gap, that is one of those things that we must do. And I'll be glad to speak to that at a different time.
I think we'll have time, hopefully, to discuss and touch upon many of the points that you brought up. I would like to give Chair Davney a chance to provide his perspective and input. Oh, you're on mute. Okay, we should be okay.
Okay, thank you for that, and thank you very much. You know, we're all expressing, I think, the common experience of Minnesotans and of the legislature here of how disruptive the COVID-19 pandemic has been. It's, as I said earlier, both provided some opportunities for greater public transparency and involvement, and also made the process of legislating much more difficult. When the pandemic first started really expressing itself here in Minnesota, and we saw the impact on the education system in mid-March, the House, on a bipartisan basis, recognized very quickly that this was going to be very disruptive, that what schools and teachers and, most importantly, students and parents needed was confidence in the process moving forward. We saw that there were needs to clear some of the playing field, to make sure that for instance, the standardized tests, that we would get a waiver from holding the standardized MCA tests this year because they just weren't functional in a distance environment, that we needed to make sure that the funding flowed and as districts had budgeted for. We prepared a bill in March. We felt such a sense of urgency. We thought Minnesota deserved an answer and security. We would have been prepared to pass that bill in March. We would have been prepared to pass that bill in April. We were finally able to get it passed in May, right at the very end of the regular legislative session. We now need to look at the impact of distance learning on students. As Chair Joachim expressed, the House is holding a series of hearings. Our first one was this morning, hearing principally from students and parents, as well as one of the ethnic councils was able to be there as well and participate on their experiences of distance learning, and anticipate, as we tried to in March, anticipate what the rest of this school year would be, anticipate what the fall might be, and what we need to put into place as legislators for schools and students and staff to have as successful a fall as we can, assessing students individually, I hope, and see where they're at and how their experience of distance learning impacts both their academic and social emotional status.
Well, that's a great transition point. I think the topic of distance learning and what that will look like and how families and students can anticipate what role that may play going forward is going to be a very important topic today. I think it's also important to recognize that the legislature itself struggled with some of the same issues in terms of setting up remote hearings and going through a different process for advancing legislation and taking input from community members. But with that in mind, and especially as we've heard the topic of distance learning and some of the concerns come up repeatedly, I would like to hear about how you as committee chairs envision the work, your work that your committees in the legislature will do heading into the summer, the fall, and potentially the 2021 session. I understand that there's still quite a bit of uncertainty in regards of how what course COVID-19 will take, but I am very interested to hear what your sense of the work of the legislature looks like going forward.
I can start with that. A couple things that I think will be critically important as we move into this uncertain time. I kind of alluded to a couple of those. One is to make sure that our students have the access to the information highway, high-speed internet, and the devices. And then also we know that it's essential that we have those additional supports for some of our students who need additional help, whether it be some special education support or some English language learner support. So we have to be more cognizant of that. And I know that was an issue this year, and I believe that we're going to have to look at how we can make sure that those support structures that students have when they're doing in-person learning can also apply in distance learning. And those things can be done. It's just going to be a work to get those done. And then regarding the importance of early literacy, that's one of the things that we will very much be focusing on. Letters training has proved to be highly effective. That's LETRS training for teachers. In fact, we know that that is so important that very scientific evidence, or I should say evidence-based reading instruction, that we require that Minnesota's in-service, Minnesota's teachers who are being prepared in our higher education institutions receive that training. And yet we have a cadre, a large volume of existing teachers who are phenomenal teachers, but they did not perhaps have that letters training. And so Senate File 7 that was in session and also in special session just this past week, Senate File 7, provided funding to every school district, every school, so that every teacher had an opportunity to have this letters type training. And that is one of the key things. We've focused on early literacy, early learning, making sure kids get to kindergarten ready to learn. And then if we can make sure our kids are reading well by the end of third grade, we will see those opportunity gaps close. And making sure our teachers have that type of training will be incredibly helpful. In the Senate, we also introduced bills that would help our schools as we navigate through this. One is e-learning days. You might be aware that current law allows schools to set up 5 e-learning days. Those are days for inclement weather, where students can do e-learning at home, or distance learning that we called it. The Senate's proposal was to also allow those e-learning days for time of a public health emergency, and then remove that cap. So it's not just 5 days. There could be more days, of course, and that's in consultation, obviously, with the district and the teachers union as well. And so I think that is one important thing. We need to update our laws to allow for that. I also believe that we need to, and again, this was part of our Senate proposal, we should be using those coronavirus funds. We have a significant amount of money coming to, about $2 billion actually coming to the state of Minnesota from the feds. And a good portion of that, I think about 600 million, 700 million is for education between the GEARS funding and the ESSER funding for education. And one of those things we should use those dollars for, we should buy a statewide subscription to a virtual school. So every public school student in every school has the option to use a virtual school aligned to Minnesota standards, comprehensive, K through 12. And of course, teachers would choose to use that differently. Some teachers might use it for one lesson, some might use it for a course. And I think that's just a tool that our educators could and should have in their toolboxes. We're talking about public school students who are still members. The funding flows, the average daily membership would still flow to those students in those schools, but let's just give our teachers that tool. So those are just a few of the things that we put forth as we try and make sure our schools, our staff have the tools necessary.
So I'd like to put this in a larger context, and that is the pandemic-driven economy. Just last week, the Department of Employment and Economic Development announced that Minnesota's unemployment rate at 9.9% is the highest it's ever been in state history, meaningfully higher than the 2008 Great Recession. That is going to have a significant impact on the state budget, but let's focus on the significant impact that is having on families across the state. And of course, that is not being experienced and has not been experienced from the beginning equitably across all of our families and all of our communities. So I think while there's always a tendency to try to, by some, to try to isolate the student independent of their family or independent of their community, I don't think we can afford to do that. We need to be looking at the report that Second Harvest Heartland and McKinsey just released yesterday or today on the rise in hunger and food insecurity in the state. They're expecting a sharp spike this fall when some of the federal supports that families have been getting ends at the end of July. Hungry kids can't learn. We need to be stepping forward on making sure that food shelves have sufficient funding, that we're working on providing sufficient funding, food in school, meals in schools for kids, and look at what we need to do there. We need to be looking at the needs of families, not just students. So more support for full service community schools so that the school serves as the hub of the community for resources and families know where to go to get their needs met either in the school or by referral out by knowledgeable people. So we need to be thinking about housing, which is something that again has been held up. The House has been pushing with the support of the multi-housing association, the Landlords Association in the state, support for housing to make sure that people have secure housing and nobody loses their apartment or their house when the executive orders end and the prohibition on eviction ends, but haven't been able to get that passed. And yet students we know who experience homelessness lose significant months or even years of their educational growth in the process. So we need to put the school stuff in a larger context of families and communities. And these are very challenging times, and the state needs to step up and lead on those.
Thank you. Chair Joachim, if you could provide your, after your answer, I believe we will begin transitioning into taking audience questions.
Thank you. I'm just sorry, my neighbor is, I'm out on my front porch and my neighbor's going that on, but she's just about to. I just wanted to amplify Chair Danley and say that we all know kids don't come in pieces, that we need to be making sure that we're thinking of the whole child, and full service community schools are a great way to do that. And I know I want to thank the organizations like yours and the ones we heard from this morning. We had the Northside Achievement Zone and folks from all the different organizations talking about how they helped partner with the school districts to partners with students and their families. because that is the only way distance learning is going to work. And that, as Senator Nelson was saying, sometimes necessity is the mother of invention, and that we need to reimagine the way we are doing school right now. And maybe this is the great opportunity to do that. And that our teachers have done an absolutely wonderful job trying their best with the tools that they have to do pivot on the drop of a hat to distance learning. But that we're hearing from students across the state, parents and teachers and school counselors and everybody about that disconnect students felt about not being in the classroom. That social emotional learning piece, that connection with other students, that connection with teachers. The students are really missing that right now. And we need to make sure that going forward, because distance learning, e-learning, that might be parts of our future, that teachers have the pedagogy and the training that they need to teach on an online platform, because it is different. And we also need to listen to those practitioners and our teachers about what kind of training they want. They're talking about wanting training on social emotional learning, wanting training on connecting with students, wanting training on mental health, because that's really been a big thing for our students in the recent years. And very happy that we could pass that in special session, tier 1 and 2, the tier 1 and 2 training for mental health. So that's where we're at. And I see that you're having a hard time hearing me. Hopefully you can hear me a little bit better now, but I will anxiously await the rest of your questions.
All right, thank you very much. To begin taking questions from the, or rather addressing questions from our communities, I think one of the main challenges that we're going to see, and one of the uncertainties that a lot of families, parents, students are struggling with is, as we've mentioned, something of a lack of certainty. With that in mind, the Commissioner of Education has asked school districts to prepare multiple scenarios for the 2020-2021 school year. As legislators and as committee chairs of the key E-12 education policy and finance committees in the legislature, how do you see your role and the role of the legislature as a whole to make sure that MDE is successfully guiding local school districts as they take on these challenges that they're being presented with?
Well, Andrew, I would say as legislators, we do our best work when we channel and amplify the voices of our constituents. And we're able to do that in different forums. We're able to gather information here today, but also share perspectives. We're also able to do that through the bills we introduce, through our participation in legislative hearings, but also through our participation and engagement with the administration. So I would say our best role is to connect with our communities and amplify those voices into the administration's decision making. This is tough because it's hard to anticipate exactly what the virus will be doing in our state and nation in 2 months, and to set a course. And it's just a source of frustration for many of us. I've got a rising high school senior, and I'd really like to know what he's going to be doing June 6th, and frankly, so would he. And I also know from talking with parents in my community, as well as school staff, they would, they're all calculating what their decision-making process will be.
I would jump into, sorry, I do have headphones on, but they might not be working very well. That we have to make sure that MDE has the tools that they need to when they're doing this guiding, and that they have the information they need. And as Chair Dabney said, that we're making sure that all those voices are at the table. I know MDE has had about 40 working groups working on this, gather all that information and doing a parent survey. But we need to make sure they also that we are talking with them about how they should be distributing the COVID funds that they did get, and then to see if there's any legislative fixes that we need to do to make sure there's the flexibility the school districts have, whether that be a few weeks early before Labor Day start time, or what other flexibility that's needed.
Just to add a couple things to that, you can never overestimate the value of good communication. And one of the things that has been helpful for me is good communication with the commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Education. I know early on I asked about, well, what percent of our kids have access to high-speed internet and how many of them have access to devices? And that information wasn't readily available. Which I think was important. We need to know that right away. And the department, I believe, has put together a very thorough survey of all of the stakeholders. I just did a quick review of it a couple days ago when it came out. And I think that document will be very helpful. The information that we heard from our constituent stakeholders all over the state about looking at that distance learning that happened from mid-March till the end of May. I think we can learn a lot from that. And basically, one of the big takeaways, as I've been also speaking with stakeholders, is that, you know, these three options that the department and the governor put out, well, our teachers know how to teach, our parents know how their students are going to learn, and students know what to expect for the traditional in the classroom learning. So that option we know how to do. The second option we tried, which was that distance learning, and there were a lot of glitches there. And of course, there's a lot more work to do there, but I think we are narrowing in on what some of those distance learning challenges were. And quite frankly, some are outside of our control, but many I think we can help eliminate. But then that third option, and that's where I'm really focused, is that hybrid model, because I get a sense, and you know, I live in Rochester and represent Rochester, and then our smaller school districts around that, Chatfield, Dover, Yoda, Stewartville, some of our smallest school districts. And I also live in an area where there's a lot of epidemiologists, of course. And so there's a good, and I get a great input from our medical community. And there's a great sense that there will be a COVID increase in the fall, you know, phase 2. We hope that it doesn't follow the trajectory of the Spanish flu, where there were 4 times as many deaths. But regardless, I think it's very likely that our school districts will be impacted. And that's why I think focusing on this hybrid model, and that's the thing that we haven't had that experience with, that I think could be incredibly helpful. So that has been helpful. And then also working, I know, I think probably Chair Dabney is the point over in the House, working on the Legislative Audit Commission. So as those federal funds come in and they're significant for education, we weigh in on what those proposals are, and we need to ultimately approve those if we want to get those funds in a timely manner here. So I think that is helpful too. And like I would say, just like anything else in life, good communication is tops.
Thank you. This next question we have is from Asian Media Access, and it speaks to some of the discussion that we've had earlier about schools being, you know, more than just buildings, more than just classes. And it's that beyond these school districts, there are many needs that are being met and being provided by schools, including informal learning, after-school program, community education, and what can be done to support those segments of schools and of education as a whole that is beyond just the school districts themselves.
It's an all hands on deck moment. It is an all hands on deck moment. We need everyone to be involved. The U.S. Department of Ag has done the Meals to You program. I thought that was innovative. I was glad to see that dollars that were not spent on school lunches, because students weren't at school having those lunches, in some cases have been sent in meals to kids. And in Minnesota, for example, those funds have been sent in the form of EBT cards, so that those dollars get to those families that were intended for food. It also requires strong community support as well. And I do think that's the lesson. There's 2 big lessons I think that we learned from COVID-19 and the stay-at-home orders and the move from traditional school to distance learning. One is that it is an all hands on deck moment. We need everyone to be involved. And secondly, that it does really even magnify the disparities that we see amongst our students. And I will say that is the most challenging piece, because as I said, as I started my conversation, education is the great equalizer. If we can get kids ready for kindergarten when they get there, get them reading well by the end of third grade, really the world is their oyster. And we just need to, and there are other great things we can do too, career and tech ed, dual enrollment, all of those types of things. But when we see our education system not be able to meet those needs because of challenges from COVID or lack of connection or lack of internet or devices, I think that is very, very challenging. And that's why we are very much going to focus on getting the tools to all of our schools, our teachers, and the families, so that excellence in education can continue. Every student has that right and deserves that and needs that.
So Andrew, I understood your question to be about that kind of out of school time, speaking broadly, but after school, both enhancement opportunities as well as recreational opportunities, as well as let's keep the kids busy and out of trouble opportunities, because we know that time after school, particularly for older children, can be a challenge. And that time after school for families can be a challenge if mom or dad are working. If we roll back to 2019, the bill that the House brought to the K-12 Education Conference Committee had several $1 million for Ignite After School, which is the state's after-school advocates and training organization, to allow them to then grant out to organizations. We know that those enhancement opportunities in after school can really, when done right, and they're in a better position to determine and assess done right than the legislature is, can really reinforce learning and provide students an opportunity to expand on that. We also know that it's another way for kids to connect with the school community. Years ago, the Search Institute out in St. Louis Park figured out that one of the most important tools for a child's development was positive relationships with adults. And particularly in the school setting, having a positive relationship with an adult who isn't grading you. Because when I was a teacher, was passing out grades, it just changes the relationship a little bit. That relationship is key, but having a relationship with caring adults who are having fun with you when you maybe are learning at the same time is also key to students' development. The idea that Minnesota's education disparities are an all hands on deck moment is not new. It's a matter of recognizing it and then acting accordingly.
Yes, and what I'd add too is that having that collaborative approach with families outside the school is so very important. We heard today from the Education Partnership Coalition, from Youth Prize, from the different organizations that have been really digging in and helping the students, not just with distance learning, but long before, because even though education is supposed to be the great equalizer, we all know that it isn't from a lot of our kids. And that was pre-COVID, that we needed to do work on making sure that it was an equalizer for all of our children. So this is where we need to really figure out how to go above and beyond what we're doing in the classroom to make sure that all of our students are connected in every different way that we can.
And I would just, and I would concur with those comments of both Chair Joachim and Chair Dabney regarding the value of after school learning and programming. I started the after school program at Willow Creek Middle School when I was teaching there. Particularly, that was targeted for students who were in danger of not reading well at the end of 8th grade. Obviously, that's a significant issue, and that is critical. And I did want to speak to the funding piece about that. One of the challenges is, do you put that funding and designate it out so that every school does that through, in this case, the Ignite After School program, which I have been to their sessions. They do a great job. Or do you put it on the per pupil formula that goes out to every school, every child, every student equally, and then let the local school district determine, do we need to use these funds for Ignite After School programming, or do we need to use these funds for another reading specialist, or do we need to use these funds for another counselor or social worker? And so there's this push-pull between, is that locally determined, or is that something that the state sets out that this money must be used in this way? And for example, that's often called a mandate when we say certain money must be used in certain ways. And this year, it's interesting to talk about extended time. Our compensatory education funding was actually, that's one of the things that the Office of the Legislative Auditor said needed to change, because the new money coming into compensatory funding had to be used for extended time. That was an agreement with the House several years ago. And what was interesting is the Office of the Legislative Auditor said, you really need to get rid of that mandate that new money be used for extended time, because we just can't prove if it works. We just don't know if that works. And there were some other challenges too. So I would just say on the funding side, we do have to be careful, knowing that our local school districts can determine best how to use funding and exactly what their needs are. It might not be the same in Chatfield as it is in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so we have to, my goal is to give a local control. I'm glad we were able to do a historic year upon year, budget upon budget increases, largest increases in the per pupil funding formula. I will look to continue to do that, and know that these things that you're talking about are incredibly important. It's just who makes the decision.
Thank you. Continuing on this point about the role that schools serve beyond simply presenting classes and getting students into buildings, one of these services that is often very important for students is mental health services. And one of the questions that we have on this is that most mental health practices are based on a Western counseling style. And the question is there a way, or how can we include cultural-based healing inside school systems?
Sure. Since I went last, I'll start first on this one. We're kind of used to doing that circular round. Yes, school-linked mental health grants were some of the funding that we passed in this last budget cycle, and those can allow for that type of culturally responsive, individual traditions type counseling. And even in the world of mental health, there are many, many different types of mental health counseling and treatments. And again, it is so individual. That's one of the challenges, that we need to make sure that all those options are available. And I do believe they are, in the way that our current mental health school-linked grants are in place.
What I would add with that too is that that cultural responsiveness has to go beyond just mental health with our students, making sure that all of our teachers and employees and staff in our schools are trained in cultural responsiveness on all levels. It needs to be at that level too, to be servicing all of our kids.
I wish I had more to share, but I think the other two, Senator Nelson and Chair Youakim, have covered it well.
Great, thank you. So our next question touches on the point that's come up repeatedly and out of necessity regarding distance learning during this spring and potentially going forward into the school year. If I could just find. Okay, there we are. And so this question speaks to some of the challenges that have been facing some of our communities, and that during the distance learning period, Asian Pacific families have often reported struggling with access to technology, particularly for parents who have limited internet access or limited access to devices. We at the council have heard of cases in southwestern Minnesota of Asian parents refusing technology that was offered because of fears that they could be held financially responsible for devices provided to students if they happen to be broken or damaged. And what can we do as a state then to help ensure that students are able to have access to the technology that they'll need to be able to participate and take full access of distance learning, even given the challenges that distance learning in and of itself presents?
Well, the good news is the Federal CARES Act funding that school districts received was eligible, amongst the eligible uses was technology, whether that was hotspots or devices or whatever was needed. Minnesota certainly is behind where it should be on broadband development. So most strikingly in greater Minnesota, that is a concern. But access to internet is a challenge across the state in all of our communities. It just may look different. That issue you brought up of parents' concerns about financial liability is an interesting one. It's not one that's been reported along to me, but I can certainly understand the parents' concerns. And we need to take a look at what are school districts' policies when they send home whether it's a Chromebook or an iPad or whatever it might be, or that hotspot that's needed. What are their policies on when it's returned in its condition? It's an interesting point you've raised.
Yeah, and I would add to not to repeat everything. There was a report that came out in 2016 from the Department of Education. And I actually only know this because I'm taking my master's right now and picked a paper I'm doing on how distance learning, how education was affected by COVID and distance learning. So in 2016, there was a report that came out that only about 53% of our schools were at a one-to-one program. And I mentioned that because they had more access and availability to switch over quickly, not just for devices, but also knowing where their students were at on that access to broadband and technology. Unfortunately, even with the one-to-one schools, just because the device is in the student's hand doesn't mean that they have the access to the technology or the support to be able to navigate that technology. So that's another place that we've fallen down on, is just not only getting the devices in kids' hands, but just to have families be able to have that access to navigate that, and to have the broadband if there's 3 kids in the class, 3 kids in the home trying to take classes at the same time. And also in that same report, over 50% of teachers felt like that they didn't have the professional development to actually teach and integrate that technology, because it really is a different pedagogy when you teach online than it is in a face-to-face classroom. And I think that's also what we're seeing so many kids struggle with, is being able to translate that social emotional learning aspect and that connectivity aspect into distance learning. So we have a lot of work to do before we can have this before the fall, so that we're ready to go if we have to pivot back to distance learning for any given point in time.
Just to add to that, I was unaware until I read your information earlier that this had been an issue, that some parents, particularly some of our Asian parents, if I understood correctly, were skeptical about taking home or allowing their child to use that school equipment. And I would hope, if it's a language issue, we would hope that our schools do have interpreters or that things are interpreted already if it's a written document. So again, that shouldn't happen. And that is a case where we need to make sure that communication is very clear with parents, and that they have an opportunity to ask questions. So if that's a question they have, we want to make sure that there's an opportunity to address that, to get that question addressed.
Thank you. The next question is, I think, related both to the funding for the schools, but also related to the significant budget deficit that the state is projected to be entering into. And so this question that we received is that schools get their revenue from the state, but the state typically holds back about 10%, it says, I believe, each year, basically borrowing money from the schools to fund other things in the state budget that are then given to the schools later. For small districts, sometimes they have to borrow money in the meantime to be able to make up for these holdbacks. Schools are afraid that in this next year, the holdback will be even bigger than it normally would. I, just reading into this question, think that may be a concern related to the budget deficit. And so just asking for, what are your thoughts on this, and how do you see this?
I'll be glad to start off on that one. That is called the 90-10 shift. So school districts get 90% of the funding that they are appropriated in that first year. And then the second year, they get the 10% that is held back. Mostly it's to address differences in enrollment numbers and such. So it's called kind of like a cleanup payment at the end. And anytime there's a shift from like 90% to maybe 87%, there is a 3% difference there that 1 year that would be problematic for our schools. But every year, our schools are getting 100% of the funding. They're getting the 90, if it's the normal shift now, it's 90% of the funding for that school year, plus the 10% cleanup payment from the year prior. And that continues year for year. But anytime you make a change in that education accounting payment that comes at the following year, as all the numbers have come in to how many students were actually served, there is a challenge and a risk there. And a number of educators have spoken to me about that, leaders. They are very concerned that as we look at what is most likely a very large deficit, we don't know, we've heard different numbers, but let me just say that Minnesota saw its revenues decrease by $4 billion. That's with the B, not quite 10% of our budget, or a little bit more than 10% of our budget. We saw those revenues decrease just from March 13th till May 1st. So in a short amount of time, we saw significant budget deficit. So we probably will be looking at a budget deficit in the fall. And that is one thing that educators are concerned about. And that's one of the reasons they were so concerned about some of the proposals earlier that we're asking our schools, saying that you're gonna have to deficit spend here about $1 million a day because of funding that's not coming in from the federal level or other places. And we expect our school districts to make that up. School administrators, school finance officers were very concerned. At first they thought, well, that might be okay because we'll just get that made up as we come back into our next budget cycle. But then as we saw our budget forecasts likely deteriorate, they realized very somberly, as we all do, that there's going to be some great financial challenges, but we're glad the feds have come in with, about $2 billion for our state, but in COVID funding, but it's going to be difficult. My hope is that we do not have to increase that payment shift, so it continues on as it is. But I do want to make sure that your listeners know that as long as there's no change in that shift, schools do get 100% of their funding. It's just, do they get it? If the shift is put in, then they get the delayed payment, the cleanup payment is larger. But they are used to operating on 90% upfront plus the 10% from the previous year. Hopefully that will continue, and we will not see this use of increasing the shift where there would be 1 year of increased liability for our schools. And that money could be used for something else. That is something I will fight against. I will argue against that. I do not believe that that would be the right way to try and solve any kind of a budget deficit.
We are looking, as Senator Nelson explains, a potentially significant budget deficit. We are seeing some increases in, for instance, consumer spending, which drives a lot of our economy and state revenues, whether it's income taxes that we receive because people are going back to work, or sales taxes because of purchases. But it's far too early to have a solid projection on what this fall is going to look like economically or our next budget cycle. It does go directly, however, to the point, the concerns underlying this question, of the need to talk about revenue. There's bipartisan conversation starting in Washington, D.C., that if we're going to have schools reopen this fall, there's going to be need for increased revenue. The federal government, of course, is in a much better position to do that because they don't have to have a balanced budget. And they can provide additional funding for schools across the country. That's probably something they should be doing. I'm glad to see that bipartisanly that conversation is starting, because schools will be experiencing different costs and increased costs to do responsible openings this fall. But we also need to look at it on a state level. It would be irresponsible not to have a conversation about revenue. This is not a time that we should just say, oh, well, and let the chips fall where they may. This is a time we should be stepping forward and making sure that Minnesotans can rely on consistent, supported, robust public services that they need. And that, of course, starts with our kids and our K-12 system.
I think one of the things that COVID did teach us is that how much our education system and our childcare system is a driver in the economy. With frontline workers, with folks staying at home, what that looks like for kids not being able to be in school. And we do have to be concerned. And there's been times in the past where that split has been shifted and that burden has fallen on our school districts, and we have to avoid that at all costs. But it is going to be a tough economic time coming up. My wish, if I had a magic wand, was to make the federal government pay for their portion of the special ed cross subsidy. Then our districts would be doing a lot better than they are right now. So something that we have to have in the forefront too is what our schools need to succeed.
Thank you. We are starting to inch towards the end of our conversation. So if you do have any more questions, please submit them. We will try to get through as many as possible. Our next question is on the issue of teacher licensing. PELSB, which is the Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board, used to have community experts. Our school had African and Karen teachers under that system, but now those same teachers are not able to get Tier 1 licenses because their degrees are not from the US and documentation is difficult to provide. Are there any plans to revisit the licensure program?
I'll take that one first.
I was about to call on someone.
It's okay. No, I think as in anything that you start out, after a few years, it needs to be tweaked. And there's different areas that we need to relook at the licensure program. One of those is that how we place the community experts in Tier 1 and trying to figure out how that's going to work. Also trying to figure out ways to make sure that we have plenty of alternative pathways for teachers to become teachers. And we'll be looking at that as well. Plus, we also need to look at the way CTE teachers are licensed. So yes, we should be looking at the tiered licensing program again next year.
Yes, just to add to that, I do believe that legislation does need to be tweaked as it moves on and as we learn new things. I would add, though, that I would ask that those teachers who have experienced that their degrees from non-US institutions do not count. I'd very much like that if they would contact me. That's the first I've heard of that particular concern. And you can put up my email address, or sen.carla.nelson@senate.mn. We should definitely look at that. I will say there were other proposals in the Senate which we were not interested in. Some of those proposals were to get rid of Tier 1 totally. In other words, our career tech, it would be the end of our career tech teachers, our community experts. And so we did not support that proposal in the Senate. But I do think we do need to make sure that highly trained teachers from other countries who come and want to have a Minnesota teaching license, those institutions should not be totally outlawed just because they're non U.S. institutions. And in fact, one of the reasons we got to the place where we literally had to do our teacher licensing system is, you might recall that our state was sued and we lost a lawsuit because our teacher licensing system was so broken that we did not even have a way for teachers, in many cases, who were trained in other U.S. states to come into Minnesota and teach. So I think we have to take a look at that. And I do hope if there's anyone who has experienced that, or maybe Andrew or Sia, maybe you can contact my office with those particulars, and we will definitely take a look at that for next year.
I'm just going to jump in here real quick. There was never a proposal to get rid of Tier 1 teachers. The only proposals for Tier 1 was to make sure that they could join the union, because that had been left out of the last tier proposal. And then also to make sure that Tier 1 and 2 got mental health training, which I'm very happy to say passed, because when we looked at the numbers, especially around special education teachers, I was really surprised to see that 50%, that is 50% of our special education teachers hold a Tier 1 or 2 license, and they weren't included in that mental health training. So just wanted to set the record straight real quick.
It's a good, well, that's a good thing to have that mental health training for Tier 1 and Tier 2. But I was talking about a proposal that had come to the Senate either last year or the year before that we did not want to pursue. So
I'll share Senator Nelson's encouragement to contact me. This is an issue of foreign trained teachers having difficulty getting licensed here that has not been raised to me in the past, and is certainly one worth exploring. So please follow up.
I would just like to echo those sentiments and encourage anybody that is facing these issues to also please do get in touch with the council, and we will do our best to both get in touch with other offices in the state government, as well as with legislators such as the chairs that have joined us today.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you put up our email addresses somewhere so participants do know how to reach us or reach out to those participants? We want to make sure that we are able to get connected and get that information. Could be after that session. But
Angeli, could I ask you to post that in the chat? Okay, we maybe only have time for one more question, but we'll try to keep moving here. And this next question is on the Grow Your Own grants. The question is, the only school, or the comment in question rather, is that the only schools that are eligible to apply are actually very narrow, because you have to partner with a Pellsby approved non-conventional teacher residency pilot program. There are only 2 in the Twin Cities that were taking new partners. Our charter school applied this last round and were able to partner with the University of Minnesota. However, the university does not have a special education licensure program as part of their Grow Your Own program. The only other university, St. Thomas, required a school or district have at least 20 participants. That's not possible for a small district. And the feeling for this questioner is that the Grow Your Own program requirements need to change to be able to fit these considerations. And we'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure, I'd like to again get connected with those exact concerns. Grow Your Own was a provision in the Senate and also probably the House. I was glad we got that through, especially in 2017 when we passed the Teachers of Color bill. We put in some particular Grow Your Own language. But I had not heard that there was an issue regarding getting willing partners on the higher education side. So again, I'd like to hear from and try and understand exactly what those concerns are. And I think Grow Your Own is a great program. We want to make sure that our teachers or our paraprofessionals who are working in our schools have the option to then go on and get their full teaching license. We also looked at Grow Your Own so that we could do kind of a two-stage model when it came to teachers of color. Particularly, we wanted to, we know that dual enrollment, PSEO, concurrent enrollment, really increases kids' graduation rates, particularly kids of color. And yet it was shocking to find out that we didn't have a single concurrent enrollment or PSEO option where high school kids who are taking those college classes while they're in high school for college and high school credit, there was no teacher education module, no option for a student to take a teacher preparation or teacher education module. And that was one of the things that we put in the Teachers of Color Act in 2017. And that requires a higher education partner too. But again, I would like to hear from people if they're having a hard time or if that's not being implemented faithfully.
I've long been a big fan of the Grow Your Own model. I represent part of the Minneapolis Public Schools, and they have used it very effectively to have significantly higher teachers of color, particularly in the earlier years as they've stood up the program, than the state average. And a significant percentage of those teachers are also bilingual because they're coming out of the communities that reflect the students. And again, going back to some of my earlier comments about the importance of having positive and affirming relationships with adults as a key strategy for working with kids in their both academic and social emotional development, having members of the community become the teachers in the community is key. So I'm a big fan. The teachers increasing the number of teachers of color in Minnesota has been a big House position. We were stymied in 2019 in getting a significant, we went into conference committee with a significant proposal to provide additional funding to the variety of programs for teachers of color. We were, as the House, able unilaterally to put some additional funding in and would have liked to have put in much more. So increase the number of teachers of color providing support for those programs is a priority. And that also includes then having a critique of those programs and what is working in those programs and what needs improvement. So again, as always, follow up with your own legislators, also follow up with us. Thank you.
I'd echo what Chair Daphne said as well. And the Grow Your Own program, I had not realized that the U of M didn't have a SPED provision, but I'm actually a SPED para during the interim. And one of my fellow SPED paras was part of the Grow Your Own program through the U of M. But now that I think of it, she was going for an elementary ed licensure. So no, this is something we definitely need to beef up the program and try to get more accessibility for folks, because as a para, having folks move in into the classroom, I think it's a great way to do it. We also have to look at all the different alternative streams that PALSB has been working on. And what got cut short this year is I was trying to work on a joint hearing with higher education just around teacher preparatory class programs. So look for that right away at the beginning of next session.
Thank you very much. Just taking a look at the time, I think we have unfortunately run out of time to be able to take additional questions, but as has been echoed a number of times now throughout our conversations, if you do continue to have questions that were not able to be addressed, do forward them and do continue to contact the council, do contact your legislatures, do contact the chairs, and we will do our best to always make sure that these are addressed. With that, I would like to offer the floor to the council's executive director, Sia Her, to leave us with some closing comments, and then we will ask the legislators to give us their final thoughts. Sia.
Thank you, Andy. Chairs Joaquin, Nelson, and Daphne, thank you so much for your time today. Unfortunately, I can't seem to work my screen so that I can access the video capability. So I'm just coming into this conversation via the voice mail system. So having said that, I would like to say that while we are unable to gather face to face, as we have done so in previous years for our legislative session recaps, I have to say that these virtual session recaps have pleasantly surprised me. Today is the second of 3 of the session recaps we are hosting. And I've seen that with today's conversation, what's consistent about it is that it has been quite informative. And I hope that this sentiment is shared by members of our community who are on the call with us. So to all 3 chairs, I thank you for your commitment to Minnesota, to a state of Minnesota where all children have a strong educational foundation. Many of you know that I am the longest serving executive director at the ethnic councils. And during my 7 years, I have had countless opportunities to work with you and to observe you in your leadership capacities, in particular where our education system is concerned. In times such as the one that we're in right now, where frustration on the part of all stakeholders, as well as expectations, are understandably and rightfully high, I think it's particularly important that you know that we at the council and all of our community members truly appreciate your work and your leadership. So thank you so much. I would also add that, and I've said this in committee hearings in times before, the Asian Pacific Minnesotan community is a community of immigrants and refugees. To the latter group, most of them came to the United States with almost nothing in the way of material wealth or education. But whether they came as immigrants or refugees, what these Americans brought with them, what they have in common are hopes and dreams. Hope that their children will have access to opportunities, and dreams that someday these opportunities will afford these very children, their parents, and their communities lives of dignity and prosperity. In other words, our parents truly believe that our education system is the most promising tool for upward mobility, even in the face of ongoing challenges such as language obstacles, because many of these very parents have limited formal schooling themselves. Chair Dabney, you said earlier that the work before you is tough. If I recall correctly, I will add that based on what we have seen, while the work is not impossible, it will be more than tough. We know that what challenges our families were facing prior to COVID-19 are now magnified many times over. However, here at the Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans, we believe that if any state is going to be able to overcome these incredibly challenging times, it would be the great state of Minnesota. And so I end on the note that as Minnesota becomes increasingly diverse, the role of our public education system is even more important than it has ever been before. Through my own experiences, I believe that when a young person is prepared for the future, he or she is better situated to work for cultural unity. So on behalf of our many communities under the Asian Pacific umbrella, we ask that you continue to work together across the partisan divide, because every child deserves a strong foundation that will arm him or her with the skills and knowledge necessary to succeed in the world beyond the education system. We at the council remain committed to helping you and other members of the legislative branch, as well as the executive branch of state government, to do our collective best to ensure that we design and implement policies that will serve every child in our state. So thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedules to be with us this afternoon. Again, I hope that our time together that you found our time together meaningful, and that we'll have countless opportunities to continue on with this dialogue about how we can best work together to serve our state of Minnesota. And with that said, I'll turn it over to all of you 3 chairs, as Andy said, for your final closing comments.
I'll go first. I just want a quick thank you all. Thank you, Executive Director Herr. Please see us as partners, and we want to make sure that we're seeing you as partners as we move forward. It really is going to be an all hands on deck for our kids. It should be all the time, but in particular addressing education after COVID. And I think we really have the opportunity to be more creative and reimagine how we're delivering education services so that all of our children have the same access So thank you very much.
Let me add my thank you as well, Ms. Herr, Mr. Morris, Ms. Cameron. Thank you all for convening this gathering today. The days ahead will be tough. Ms. Herr, I appreciate your optimism about Minnesota. I feel the same, but we need also to recognize that's a choice. We can move forward equitably and inclusively if that's the path Minnesota chooses. Or we can move forward in a way that continues the legacy of racial disparities that exist today. I'm hoping we choose the former and not the latter, but we need to recognize we all need to come together and make the choice. So thank you very much for the opportunity today.
And let me just add my thanks as well. I so appreciate your leadership, Sia. We worked together for a number of years, and I just want your council to know that you are well represented in the legislature. Your executive director does a great job working with the legislature and keeping us informed. And I do want to add also to those very important comments about an all hands on deck moment, about working together. We must do that. It is essential that we keep the American dream open for student. And yes, I do believe that the COVID-19 challenges have exacerbated some of those disparities. And yet we know that education is the key to closing not just the achievement gap, but to closing housing disparities and income disparities and health disparities. And that is why I am very much looking forward to working again across the aisle to make sure that we put forth the greatest effort possible to make sure that our education system does not leave any child behind. And just to note, both the bill that Representative Dabney and I brought for the education funding regarding COVID, that was passed with broad bipartisan support in the Senate. I think it was 66-1 passing that bill. That's that type of bipartisan work that we need. And the policy bill that Chair Joachim and I just passed here during special session passed the Minnesota Senate 67-0. And I just thank my chairs over in the House. I know that working together, we can work to make sure that our education system best prepares kids, even in the time of COVID-19 and the budget challenges that follow. So thank you for allowing me to join you today. We wish everyone well and know that our job is to work together. I believe we will and we can.
Thank you all very much for your final thoughts. We look forward to hearing from everybody in the future and working together. And this will adjourn our meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, chairs. Have a great rest of the day.